Good evening, everybody. Shavua Tov. Tonight, we will be reading stories from Rabbi Meshulam Zusha. So, to put him on the timeline of all the rabbis we've learned about so far, he is also one of the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, one of the early Hasidic rabbis, and the brother of the person we're going to be learning next week, Rabbi Eli Melech of Lezhinsk. Tonight's stories, his stories are some of my favorite, and I am looking forward to just jumping right in. So we're going to start. The first story is not really a story, it's his take on tshuva. Tshuva is what we focus on mostly in the high holidays, but it's something that we do any point in the year. It means repentance. Tshuva means, the root has shuv in it, which means to return. And we do tshuva when we've done something wrong and we want to make up for it. But Reb Zusha has a different take on what tshuva means. I'll read this excerpt now. It says, "But thou knowest the truth," Reb Zusha is talking to God, "that I haven't the strength to do tshuva. What then can Zusha do? He will bring up to thy holy habitation the letters composing the word tshuva." So Reb Zusha is saying tshuva is very hard. But when you take it apart, when you take each letter, it's possible to achieve this. He says the word is comprised of the initial letters. Tshuva is Taf, Shin, Vav, Bet, Hey. And he says if you take apart tshuva, you make it from these verses. The first is this, Tamim with the Taf. Tamim tiyeh im Elohecha. You should be whole before God. Shiviti Adonai lelegdi tamid. I have set the Lord in front of me always. The Vav comes from Ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. You should love your neighbor as yourself. The Bet, Bechol d'rachecha daho. In all your ways know Him, know God. And the Hey from Hatzna lachet im Hashem Elohecha. Walk humbly before God. So Reb Zusha is saying that he can't do tshuva. Tshuva, as he understands it, is very difficult in and of itself, but when you take it apart into its component parts, that is to say, when you take tshuva apart into the letters that make up tshuva, and then into the verses from which those letters come, then tshuva becomes possible. The taf is from you should be whole before God, because tshuva is about righting some kind of wrong. It's about taking whatever is broken and trying to fix it so that way you feel whole before God. The shin comes from I've set the Lord in front of me always, which is to say part of tshuva is about recognizing that in the world we have a responsibility to God who created it. When you do something that kind of goes against what you know in your heart to be right, what you believe God wants from you, then you're not doing tshuva. And he says when you do tshuva, you're putting God in front of you in that sense. The Vav, as we said, is from you should love your neighbor as yourself, ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, because tshuva is not just about person to God, it's also from person to another person. When you do tshuva, you ask yourself, what have I done to hurt others, not just God, not just yourself. And so here, you should love your neighbors as yourself is kind of the heart of tshuva. There's 5 letters in tshuva, and the Vav is right in the middle. And so that love that you express toward others is right at the heart of tshuva. And then the Bet comes from in all thy walks know Him, b'chol d'rachecha daho, which is to say when you do tshuva and you feel whole, and you're loving your neighbor as you love yourself, then if you have the possibility of knowing God, if you're not whole in the way you carry yourself, then you're not going to be able to know God. And then finally the Hey at the end of tshuva Comes from the verse Hatzne lechet im Hashem Elohecha, walk humbly with God. Once you feel whole, once your outlook on the world is one where God is in front of you, where you love your neighbor as yourself, then you're able to walk with God. So what Reb Zusha is saying, he started with a kind of tongue-in-cheek saying, I can't do tshuva. Tshuva is too hard. But actually, when you take it apart into its components, says Reb Zusha, there's actually, the letters themselves provide a formula, one step at a time, for doing tshuva. I'm going to read you now a story. It's called The Unlearned Near to God. This is also about Reb Zusha and about his brother, Elimelech of Lezhinsk, also a great early Hasidic rabbi, who, according to the story, initially was part of the circle of mitnagdim. Those are the individuals who were not, who were opposed to the Hasidic movement. To remind us, in the late 18th century, I believe actually, the Baal Shem Tov was born right in the year, as far as we know, 1700. So throughout the 18th century, the Hasidic movement was gaining more and more traction, and it was in juxtaposition to the movement who called themselves the Mitnagdim. The Hasidics were, the Hasidic Jews were all about finding God in the everyday, not expressly through Torah and Talmud learning. And the Mitnagdim were specifically interested in learning Talmud and learning all of the ins and outs of every single page of that work. The Hasidic leaders said that's actually counter to knowing God. You're going farther away from God when you do that. It's not like that's not important, but you can't make that the end-all, be-all of what it means to be a Jew. So this story is about Reb Zusha, who was an early Hasid, and him convincing his brother, who we're going to read about next week, to also live that kind of lifestyle. Rabbi Zusha of Anipol was not learned in the Torah like his brother, the Lezhinsker, but he became a Hasid earlier. Once the Lezhinsker asked his brother, "Why do you waste your time with Hasidism? If you have spare time, you should increase your knowledge of the Torah. That is to say, if you have spare time, learn some Talmud. Don't walk in the forest. Don't look, into nature. Don't, take the time for reflection. Go into the Talmud and learn." Rabbi Zusha replied, "I'll tell you a story. There was once an artisan who saved up a sum of money and decided to move to the royal residence where he could see more often his greatly beloved master, the king." Now we see this trope in Hasidic stories a lot. You have individuals who are interested in getting closer to the king, and that is their life's goal. And here, of course, the king is God, and we have an artisan who sells his shop in order to have enough money to move to be closer to the king. To get closer to God is the metaphor here. On his arrival, he induced the chamberlain to assign him the task of furnace man in the palace, so that he might be near the king. He strove to keep the palace at an even temperature, and to do everything to make the ruler comfortable. The king became aware of this, and asked to see the furnace attendant. The man told him he had given up his trade to accept a post which would bring him in association with the ruler, and he asked for permission to see the latter whenever he wished. The king replied he could not be disturbed in this way, but he permitted the loyal servant to bore a hole in the ceiling of the throne room, whence he could behold him. In the meantime, a prince had displeased his royal father and was banished from the palace. The prince wished to catch a glimpse of his royal sire, and therefore accompanied the furnace man to the garret, whence he could look at the king through the crevice. He could understand, however, what he beheld in the throne room better than the other man. We both love our master, the Lord, continued Rabbi Zusha. Through following the instructions of Hasidic rabbis, I, the unlearned, feel myself near to God. How much more will you, a learned Rav, before became a famous Rebbe? Okay, let's take that apart. There are so many little gems in that story. First of all, the character in the story who sells his wares to go and try and get close to the king, you see here a real love of the king, a real love of God, a belief that when one is close to, just to use the metaphor of the story, when one is close to the king, one can be inspired by the way the king holds himself. One can be inspired by the glory of the king. One can be inspired by watching the ways the king makes decisions. In the same way, there's the Hasidic mindset when you go out in the world is to see God everywhere, to believe that everywhere you're looking, and to know deep down that because everything is one, everything that we're seeing is an expression of some part of God. That's not the way that the mitnagdim would look at the world. They would not say that God is in every single thing, that the best way to learn about God is to just have the right mindset when you go out. They would say you need to learn the Talmud. No, he says, you can actually learn about God by just striving to be close in your heart and by believing that everything you see is an expression of God. So this person sells his wares, that is to say, gives up a material pursuit in the world in order to get close to the king. When he gets to the palace, he asks for a job, and he's given the job of being the furnace man. And it's not a glamorous job, but he's doing it with all of his heart. He's doing such a good job that the king takes notice. That is to say, in our own lives, we are given a job, so to speak. I am Sam. You are who you are. My wife is Kayla, and these are, this is what we walk around the world in. This is our job, so to speak. And when we do it well, it pleases the king, to use the metaphor of the story again. He could have easily complained that he wanted a more glamorous job, not to be a furnace man. But here, he's trying to say that even the least exciting position in this world, when done well, elicits the love of the king. And our next story is all going to be about, Rebbe Zusha's belief that one needs to live out who they are to their fullest. So let's continue in this story, just looking at the rest of these metaphors. So the king heard about this furnace man, that he was doing such an excellent job keeping the castle at the right temperature, and he requested to see this person working the furnace. And so he did. And this furnace man, you can imagine his excitement at finally getting to speak to the king, asked if he could approach the king and see him whenever he wanted. And the king said, no, I can't be bothered in that way. Which is to say, for us, we don't always have access to God. Rabbi Zusha says even the person who's living out their true life, who's doing the best thing that they can, in the best they can in this world, whose heart is in the right place, even they don't have, access to God 100% of the time. But, he says, the king said, because you are, so beloved to me in my palace, I'll allow you to have a small hole where you can see the throne room. That is to say, this person has access to the glory of the king whenever he wants. And that's more than he had before. It's not a lot. But in the story, you see he's content with his position, because in a moment, the king and the prince, his son, have a falling out. And the son is kicked out of the palace and wants so desperately to see his father, the king. And so he gets in touch with the furnace man, who invites him to share that, small hole where they can look through, and see what the king is up to. And so Reb Zusha says that him, as an unlearned person, gets to know God through having the right mindset, through that small hole, through that small window into what the king is doing. How more so would that prince in the story be able to understand what was going on in that throne room, who had actually lived inside the palace with the king? He'd be able to understand nuances of what the king was doing much more so than that furnace man. So too, he says, when one has that level of Torah learning, plus that right mindset, one can understand God on such a deep level. And so that was enough to convince Elimelech, Zusha's brother, to also become a chassid and to live life with that outlook, to shift the priority from Talmud study to living a life of God-centeredness. I'm going to share two more very short stories from Reb Zusha. The first is just a small poem. It says, "Earth, O earth, thou art better than I. Why therefore do I tread on thee? But my day will come, and I will be buried within thee." I think it kind of speaks for itself, this poem. It is to say that the earth is quite large and was even created before man in the 6 days of creation. So in that sense, it has a deeper wisdom than we do. But why do we walk on it? He doesn't have a good answer. But he says, someday our time will come when we will be buried underneath it. Just a beautiful thought from Reb Zusha. Okay, the last story that I'm going to share is also about death. Part of the Hasidic outlook on life is not just about God-centeredness, but it's also about remembering who one is, and that comes with remembering one's mortality. We so often look over the fact that someday we won't be here anymore, that someday we're going to die. And Rabbi Zusha held that fact in front of him, and through that was able to, perhaps live out, a life that was deeper and more meaningful than others who might ignore that fact. So, this is a very, very famous story. You might have heard it before. It's very short, but packed. So it says, Reb Zusha used to say, "I do not grieve over the fact that when I come to the next world and they ask me there why I was not like our master Moses, I shall not be able to give an answer. But fear and trembling befalls me when I think of the fact that they may ask me why I was not more like Zusha. That question I shall surely be unable to answer." He says, when I die, I'm not worried that in the next world they'll ask me why I wasn't like Moses. I can't be like Moses, says Zusha. I'm not Moses. I don't have the humility of Moses. I don't have the mind and body of Moses. That's not a question I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is they might ask me why I was not more like Zusha. Why did I not live out who I was? Why did I not make choices that I knew that I needed to make in order to live out the values that I held deep? That's what I worry about, he says. So you see, what we can learn from Reb Zusha is the importance of being oneself, of living out the values that one holds dear, but also making sure to hone those values by a knowledge and a reminder that someday we are going to go to that next world, whatever it is. Someday we are going to die. And that in this world, our hope needs to be tapered. We can't expect, as we heard in that story, to have constant access to the king. That is to say, we can't expect in this world to be, close to God no matter what, in every single moment. Rather, we should be happy with our lot. We should do our job well. Whoever we are, we should be the best person, we can be. I'll be the best Sam. You'll be the best you. And that through that, we can enjoy, a glimpse into the glory of the throne room. So, full. So, with that, we're going to end a little early tonight. We don't have a lot of stories from Reb Zusha. As opposed to next week, Elimelech HaLegitz, his brother, has a lot more writing associated with him. So with that, I wish everybody a Shavua Tov. I hope you have a wonderful week. And I'll look forward again to more Hasidic teachings next Saturday night. Shavua Tov, everybody.